Hello, my name's David Barry and this is a pre-recorded lecture on hazard identification and risk management. Now, apologies that I'm not teaching this live today. I had intended to, and when we put the timetable together, that was certainly the intention. However, I've been scheduled for cochlear implant surgery this week, so hence I can't be with you. Anyway, let's get on with it. So a bit of background about me. I come from an airline background. I spent just under 11 years responsible for operational safety at a UK airline. And many of the things I'm going to be talking to you about today are things I wish I'd known when I was looking after hazard identification and risk assessment at that airline. So we're going to be talking about some techniques that may not be very commonly used today, but are in the direction that we're heading in terms of innovation in safety management and risk assessment. So the topics we'll cover today, we'll be looking at hazards, we'll be looking at some definitions. What is a hazard? What is a risk? Some of these things you might be familiar with already, but it doesn't hurt to go over them again. We'll be looking at ways that we can identify hazards, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time looking at risk assessment methods, both qualitative methods and also quantitative methods. So we'll be getting stuck into some more complex methods of risk assessment. Now, we have a couple of hours here and we don't have time to go into a huge amount of detail about all these different methods. So rather than this being a teach you how to do them, because some of the methods we could be spending a week-long course on in their own right. But what we're going to do, what I'm intending to do today, is at least give you an awareness of some of the methods that are out there, when you should be using them, when maybe some other methods may be more suitable, and that kind of thing. We're also going to be looking at some topics around things like eliciting knowledge from subject matter experts, so that we have to do that if we don't have data, if we haven't measured data for whatever reason. We'll be talking about some of those things as well. And then finally, we're going to look at the last piece in the jigsaw. Once we've done the risk assessments, once we've identified the hazards, carried out the risk assessment, what do we do then? Well, we have to manage the risks. So we're going to spend some time looking at that too. Okay, let's get started. So let's have a look at these pictures. Over on the left we have fire in flight, smoke on the flight deck. We have an engine that's clearly seen better days. We have an aircraft flying in the region of significant terrain. We have another aircraft flying around weather. We have icing, we have jet blast, and we have an aircraft there that's hit a bird on the nose cone. What are all those things? What are they? And what do they have in common? And what other things can you think of that are similar to that? Well, they are hazards, of course. And what they have in common is that they have the potential to cause us some form of harm. And when we're talking about harm, we don't necessarily just mean death and destruction, damage to equipment, loss of life, injury, that kind of thing. But we could be talking about financial loss, we could be talking about loss of reputation even. You may have come across the UK CAA's Significant 7 hazards. Sometimes they're referred to as risks, but we'll come on to that in a bit. So we have their loss of control, runway excursion, controlled flight into terrain. Well, you can read them for yourself. These Significant 7 risks were derived from industry feedback some time ago now, and operators in the UK were asked to submit and discuss the risks and hazards that they were most concerned about in their operation at the time, and this was the final list that was put together. I think it's a pretty comprehensive list. I think it covers a lot of the main hazards that we face in aviation. Just take a moment. Can you think of any others? I'm not saying there are any others, but is there anything that you think might be missing there? I think it's probably fairly all-encompassing. I think there are a lot of things. They're quite broad categories that they cover. So pretty good list there. The thing that we need to be aware of, though, is that that list there was a snapshot in time. So this was operators that were asked to submit their main risks that they were seeing in their operation at that time. And so there is the possibility that there may be some availability bias there. So things that had occurred recently, maybe some accidents or incidents that were recently in the news that the industry was well aware of and at the forefront of our mind. It may be that those things, due to availability bias, came up first, and things that haven't happened for a long time may have been perhaps overlooked. But that's just natural, that's the way these things work. But having said that, even though something hasn't happened for a long time, doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen again at some point. So it's always important that we don't just focus on the most recent things, that we do look back in history and think, okay, could that happen again? So we know what a hazard is. It's something that has the potential to cause us some form of loss. But what is a risk? Let's look at this simple example here. Now, I'm deliberately not using an aviation example because I know there's different levels of experience and knowledge of aviation in the cohort today. So what I want to do is take it right back to basics, so we're all starting from the same level. And let's think about something that we commonly encounter in our lives, assuming that most of us drive. Look at this picture here. What is the hazard here? What's the thing that has the potential to cause us some kind of harm? Well, clearly the bend is the hazard there. And when we are thinking about hazards and risks, we usually also think about the event that releases that hazard, if you like. And we'll talk a bit about bow ties later on in the course, and I'm going to touch on some of the terminology in a few moments here. But when we're looking at a hazard, we think of what is it that could release that hazard. So this is a hazard. It's a hazard as we approach this bend. We're going to drive around it. What could potentially go wrong? What would the thing that needs to happen for us to experience some form of loss? I think most of you are probably thinking loss of control as we drive around the bend, and I'd agree. That is the thing that we would consider to be the top event, the thing that releases the hazard. Let's just think a moment about some other terms that we might use. What would be the consequences of us losing control on that bend? Well, there could be damage to our vehicle. We could hit another car coming on the other direction, have a head-on collision. Ultimately, it could be injury or death. So it could be potentially catastrophic for us. So thinking about this in terms of a bow tie, which Simon will be talking about later in the course, this is a very simplistic depiction of a bow tie, but it covers all the main terminology there. So what we have in the middle is the hazard, that's us driving around the bend or the bend. The top event, the thing that can release that hazard and lead to harm, is losing control as we go around that bend. Consequences, as I've just mentioned, could be crashing into the barrier, crashing into the wall, damage to our car, death, injury, and so on. So the consequences are fairly easy to determine. Things get a bit more complicated when we're trying to think about the threats that could lead to that. So in bow ties, we have this concept of threats. These are the things that can allow the top event to occur. So what could a threat be? Something that makes the top event more likely. Just have a think about that for a second. Well, one thing, if we were driving around that bend and it was wet or icy, that is going to make it more likely that we would lose control of the car. If we were approaching the bend far too quickly, that could be another threat that could contribute to us losing control of the car. Perhaps, say, if the sun was low and we had poor visibility, maybe fog, or we were dazzled by the sun, that could be another threat. So these are things that make that top event more likely to happen. And what we can do is we can put in place barriers that try to prevent that threat escalating to the top event. So, for example, if I was talking about driving too fast around that bend, something we could put in place, and by the way, when I'm talking about barriers, generally we're not talking about physical barriers, although in this case it may be appropriate, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But if I was talking about a threat of excess speed as we go into that bend, well, one thing we could do is put up signage to warn drivers of the bend that's coming along. We could have an appropriate speed limit. We could have one of those signs that flashes to warn people if they're driving too fast, and so on. Something, if we were talking about weather, so the surface, we could, if it was icy, we could make sure that the road surface was gritted and there was a routine program of gritting and de-icing the road if there was poor weather. So these are the things that we can put in place to try and stop the threat escalating to the bad event. Now, none of these barriers typically are perfect. So none of them will potentially, will always 100% for sure stop the bad occurrence from happening. But some are more effective than others. So typically, when we're thinking about risk management, and Simon will talk a lot more about this later in the course, but we'll be talking about the effectiveness of these barriers and how good they are at preventing the top event from occurring. So let's assume that our barriers have been breached for whatever reason, that the driver didn't see the signs of the bend coming up and the driver has lost control of the car going around the bend. Now, what do we have? We can have barriers this side on the bow tie that actually prevent the consequences or try to mitigate the consequences as far as is possible. So for example, here we could lose control, and one thing that could help prevent major consequences might be the barrier that we saw here. So rather than just driving, hitting the wall and going straight over the embankment there, we have a barrier here that could keep us on the road. Sure, we would get damage to our vehicle, and there may be a risk of head-on collision if we're heading in this direction, but that gives us some protection against driving through that wall. Going back to this, if we had other barriers could potentially be, well, have a moment, what do you think? There are things that the car is equipped with, for example, like airbags, ABS braking, and those sorts of things. So these are the sorts of things that aim to prevent the consequences from escalating. They might not actually prevent everything, but they might mitigate the severity of that consequence. So clearly, if an airbag goes off, we've had a collision, so that's a bad thing. The top event has occurred. We do have a bad consequence, but the idea of the airbag, of course, is to protect the occupants from injury. Okay, so that's basically how a bow tie is set up. And like I say, Simon's going to be going through that in more detail. So we know what the hazard is. What are the components, though, that make up a risk? Well, I've spoken about the severity of the consequences, so that's fairly easy to define. The other main component of risk is the likelihood of that hazard causing us some form of harm. And that's sometimes a little bit more, well, actually usually more difficult to quantify than the severity. So here, how would we determine what is the likelihood of us losing control of the car as we drive around this bend? You might have some ideas. Perhaps we could be looking at previous accident reports. I'm assuming we don't have personal history of driving around this bend and losing control lots of times. So we might look at, if it was available to the public, accident reports on how often accidents occur on this particular stretch of road. We might look at more generic things. If we don't have data specifically on that, we might look at similar bends or look at accident reports relating to how often drivers lose control on bends like this. We might look at things like how often do icy conditions occur on the bend, and that all helps us define what the probability of us losing control on that bend might be. But it is hard to do that, and we'll come on to some of those methods later on in this session. But there's one thing missing there. We've got the probability of us losing the control on the bend as we drive around that bend, and we know what the severity of the consequences can be. What's missing though? Well, something that's quite often overlooked is our exposure to that hazard. And exposure is the other component of risk. Exposure is important to consider because if we are looking at this activity over a long period of time, not just a one-off, if we're not just looking at it that we are driving around that bend, that we're doing it one time and that's it done. If we're thinking about it as a longer term activity, say that we are going to drive around that bend on our daily commute, then we need to look at and consider our exposure to that hazard. And our exposure is how many times we encounter it. So one way of dealing with risk and mitigating risk is to reduce our exposure. So for example, if we thought we were going to lose control on that bend, then perhaps if we chose another route and never went on that bend, we've effectively mitigated that risk, we've reduced our exposure to that hazard. Usually though, we don't have that luxury of completely avoiding the activity when we're thinking about risk assessment and risk management. But it's important to think about it in terms of if we're driving around that bend once a year, or we're driving around that bend twice a day, then our risk looks very different because our exposure is much increased if we are doing it as a daily or regular activity. So those are our main three components of what a risk is: severity, probability, and exposure. Now we know that and we know what a hazard is. What's the next thing we need in terms of what we need to do for risk management? What are the building blocks that we need to think about? We usually don't have just a single hazard that we're interested in. We usually have a whole array of hazards that we need to think about. We think about aviation in general. There is a multitude of hazards, things that could potentially cause us harm, but we manage those risks associated with those hazards. But let's come back to another basic example. So a core building block of risk management is hazard identification. So we need to identify those things that can potentially cause us some form of harm. So you think I'm obsessed with roads, but let's use another simple example. Here we have a curvy road going through some nice countryside there, and this is going to be our daily commute, which would be a lovely daily commute. Let's think about what, if we were going to do that and we were so into risk management that even our drive to work, we carried out risk assessment for it. And we want to identify the hazards associated with driving along this particular stretch of road. How can we identify those hazards? How would you go about thinking about what those hazards could be? This part of risk management can be quite difficult, even for a simple example like this. If you're thinking about flying to a new destination or introducing a new bit of equipment, whether that's a ground power unit or whether it's an aircraft, identifying the hazards related to that activity can be quite challenging. Let's think about this very simple example though. What would we do to identify the hazards? Well, again, as we said in the previous example, we could look at accident reports if they're available. Look and see how many times accidents have occurred on this particular stretch of road. We could look at things like weather and how often do we get icy, snowy, rainy conditions on this road. We could maybe have things like wildlife hazards with animals roaming around on the road, those kinds of things. So we can start to think about what those hazards might be. It helps though if we've got some kind of data. So if we do have previous accident reports, we have the results of some investigations that have occurred. It would help, for example, if we could drive along the road ourselves and give it a try and see, try and experience what those hazards might be. We might do that on multiple occasions. Quite often, though, we need to think about it. We need to brainstorm it. So we'd sit down in a group of people who have some experience of driving along country roads, and we could combine our collective knowledge to think about those hazards. So it helps if this hazard identification can be done in a group. So there's different experiences and different, when I say experiences, I mean level of experience, different people who have different viewpoints. So if you're looking at flying a new route, for example, in an airline, then you might have somebody from a pilot background, you might have somebody from a cabin crew background, you might have somebody from a maintenance background, and so on. So people with their own different viewpoints on what the hazards might be. So this is called eliciting knowledge from subject matter experts, and we're going to talk about that later in this session as well. But sometimes it's a very useful tool to help us identify hazards, particularly when we don't have data relating to what hazards might be. When it comes to the methods that we have for identifying hazards in aviation, think of this space. This is the space that we operate in, and these little warning triangles are the hazards that are out there, the things that can potentially cause us some form of harm or loss. This list isn't exhaustive, but one of the mainstays of hazard identification in aviation traditionally, and something that has been done really well, is investigation. Considering that aviation is an industry and an activity that is not much more than 100 years old, we have done a fantastic job at learning from when things have gone wrong to make an ultra safe industry that we have today. So we learn about hazards from investigation. We learn about hazards through things like quality systems, safety audits, line operations safety audits, where people observe activities. In this case, someone sits on a jump seat and observes any errors that the flight crew might be making. We have safety reporting, a big one, of course, and one of the most valuable and versatile methods of identifying hazards that we have, where people can report occurrences that they've considered unsafe or may have been near misses or may actually have resulted in some form of loss. We have things like confidential reporting, where it's a safety reporting system, but where people don't have to identify themselves. We have things like flight data monitoring that are really useful tools in the context of airline operations and in aircraft operations in general. If you want to know a bit more about flight data monitoring, we're not covering it specifically on this course, but there is a recorded brief introduction to flight data monitoring on Canvas that you should be able to find there. We have things like fatigue risk management systems and so on. And the size of the circles, by the way, doesn't represent their importance or their effectiveness in any way. I've just done it randomly. But the point is that we have these different systems out there, and this list isn't exhaustive. There are others, but all of these things are aimed at identifying things that could potentially cause us harm. None of them are perfect, of course, and you'll notice that some of the hazards that are around aren't always picked up by one of these activities. And those are the things that keep safety managers awake at night, the things that we don't know about. So we're constantly trying to evolve these systems and make them better. and introduce new systems if necessary to try and identify more and more hazards. Because even though aviation is an ultra safe industry, we still aim to make it even safer. I did just mention that there is a short introductory video on Canvas for flight data monitoring. There's also an introduction to safety data, so some of the sources of safety data, some of the sources of hazard identification data that we have available to us in aviation. There's a short brief video to that on Canvas too. Once we've identified the hazards, what's the next stage in risk management? What do we need to do now? The thing that we need to do now is, because we don't have infinite resources, we don't have infinite time, we don't have infinite people to work on these things, we don't have infinite financial resources, we have to prioritize the hazards. So we have to look at each hazard and decide which of these is most likely to cause us some form of loss and harm, and we try also to quantify that harm too. So prioritizing how we deal with these hazards is another way of saying risk assessment. Which of these things is most likely to cause us some form of loss? If we think about this simple safety cycle, so much is written about safety management, and a lot of it overcomplicates it in some ways. In a lot of ways, it is just this simple cycle. So we're identifying the things that can potentially cause us harm here. We then prioritize them. Think of the ones that we need to deal with first, which ones we can leave for later. We then put in some method of control and mitigating those hazards so that they don't cause us some form of loss. And then we monitor the effectiveness of those controls. So we monitor whether they are actually working. And that cycle goes on and on and on. But it's that part, prioritizing, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about risk assessment. We use risk assessment when we're identifying hazards. And so we react to things that have been reported to us. We react to things that have been identified through things like flight data monitoring or safety audits. So we look at those issues that have been raised, those hazards that have become known to us, and we will risk assess those things. But we also need to carry out risk assessments to help us when we're making decisions. We need to think about if we're making a change to what we do, to an activity, maybe introducing a new activity, maybe introducing a new piece of equipment, or introducing some kind of significant change, then we need to carry out a risk assessment. So some examples there. Should we reduce the maintenance interval for that piece of equipment? We could save some money by doing that, but what are the risks? Then we have to go through that hazard identification and risk assessment process. Can we fly safely into a specific airport? Is it safe to temporarily reduce the taxiway width at some part of an airport, for example, and so on and so on. So these are all things that we would need to carry out a risk assessment before we actually make that change to that activity. Now, it should be done, the risk assessment should be carried out before that activity is undertaken. In one of my previous jobs, I spent nearly 11 years working in a UK airline, and I was responsible for operational safety there. And it used to always really annoy me that our charter department, with the best intentions in the world, if they had a spare aircraft available for a period over, a summer period, they used to sell time on that aircraft for charter stuff. So in amongst our routine scheduled work, the charter team would sell some time on an aircraft that could be used for a charter thing, maybe flying backwards and forwards to holiday destinations over a summer period. And what would often happen would be that they would sign up to a holiday company and say, okay, we've got this lucrative deal that we are now going to use that spare A320 and we are going to be operating 5 times a week to Ajaccio in Corsica. And it's a done deal. We've signed on the dotted line, away we go and do that. Now, from my point of view, suddenly I have the problem of working out how we can do this safely. It's an airfield. It might be an airfield that we don't fly into routinely as part of our scheduled operation, so it's something new. It might be challenging. There might be a big chunk of terrain like Ajaccio. There might be all sorts of issues there. Worst case is that it's a very complicated airport to fly into, and it might need, it might be a captain's only landing, it might be training captains only, or it might be that pilots have to fly the approach in the simulator before they're allowed to actually do it in real life. And you might think, well, that's fine, we're mitigating the risks there, that's okay. But actually all these things are ending up costing a lot of resources. They are taking time from simulators, they're disrupting the whole roster pattern for accruing. So the whole thing ends up costing a lot. And it might be then that once you put these mitigations in place so that you can do this activity safely, it ends up not being worthwhile doing. So the risk assessment should be done up front. It shouldn't be a done deal that you're saying, well, we're definitely going to do this. We've signed on the dotted line. Now let's carry out the risk assessment and look at what hazards there might be. It should be done the other way around, of course. Let's look now at some of the methods we can use to prioritize those hazards. So in other words, risk assessment methods. A couple of definitions to start, because these are terms we'll be using a lot for the rest of this session. You're probably aware of them already, of course, but let's just go over them again so we've got a baseline here. When we're talking about something being qualitative, as it says there, it means it relates to the quality of something rather than its quantity. On the other hand, quantitative is relating to or measuring the quantity of something rather than its quality. Okay, so we have those two different definitions, and risk assessment broadly falls into those two categories. We have qualitative risk assessment. It tends to be risk assessments that are more subjective in character. They can be based on data, but often rely on subject matter expert knowledge and experience and opinion. Qualitative risk assessments have a benefit that they are generally intuitive, and there's not a big barrier to understanding those methods. Something we're going to talk about as well, though, is that they can give the impression of being more numerically based than they actually are, and that happens especially when we start looking at risk matrices, which you may well have had some experience of using, and we'll be talking about those in a moment. Quantitative risk assessment is more objective. It's usually based on data using numerical methods, and it can also involve the use of subject matter experts and their knowledge, particularly where data isn't available. But it can involve complex modelling and knowledge of some probability theory, and that can be a barrier to understanding. So quantitative risk assessment can be more complex and less intuitive than qualitative risk assessment. And that probably goes some way to explaining why in some areas of aviation, such as in the domain of airline operations, we tend to focus nearly always on qualitative risk assessment rather than quantitative risk assessment, because it's easier to do. We don't require specialist knowledge. Whereas in the design areas and particularly in design areas and sometimes in maintenance areas, then quantitative risk assessment is more common, and we'll talk about some of those methods in a moment. Quite often these methods or risk assessment methods aren't wholly qualitative or quantitative. They can be quite often blended together, and in some ways you can get the best of both worlds in that. And later on, we're going to talk about some of the advanced methods that do that very well. I'm sure some of you have had experience of using risk matrices. They are ubiquitous. They are out there being used in all sorts of domains, not just in aviation, but across other safety critical activities too. You'll find them in nuclear, rail, other transport domains, petrochemical, all sorts of industries that undertake safety critical activities. They're really intuitive to use. So if I was to put a risk matrix in front of you now and ask you to risk assess something, you could use the risk matrix generally. There's not a huge barrier to understanding them and learning how to use them. That's a good thing in that it allows lots of people, lots of stakeholders to get involved in the risk assessment process, and because they are easy to use. And they're very useful, or can be useful, when there's little or no data available. So we are relying more on subjective, qualitative methods. However, some people have said that risk matrices are actually worse than useless. By the way, that's meant to be a chocolate teapot rather than a turd on a plate. So it's not my picture. But yes, there's a really interesting paper by Anthony Cox in 2008. And he says that risk matrices can actually be worse than useless. They can do more harm than good. And his reason for saying that is that they give the impression that they are founded on some rigor, some scientific rigor that is the basis of their design and how we use them. However, that's not really the case. It's something that I assumed when I first started working in the safety domain and using risk matrices. I assumed there was some background research that had gone into them to say this is why we have 5x5 matrices, which tend to be most common, and this is why we multiply the values together, and that's why we end up with the answer we get. And I thought, great, well that's the sort of tried and tested method of doing this. But actually, as we'll see in a moment, there are some pitfalls to using them and that we really need to be aware of. Sure, they do have their place, but in a safety critical industry such as aviation, Anthony Cox there is making the point that perhaps we should be doing something more rigorous than just solely relying on risk matrix, similar to the one that you'll find in ICAO's Safety Management Manual and a whole host of other publications from different regulators. At the top there, it says, fundamentally, a risk assessment tool should be able to distinguish between tolerable and intolerable risk. That's essentially one of the things that we have to get from any form of risk assessment method. We have to be able to use the method to determine whether the resulting risk is something that we are content to live with, whether it's something that needs some action, or whether it's something that we just have to avoid completely and that is completely intolerable. We have to do some serious mitigation or avoid doing that activity altogether. So let's just look at this. This slide is intended to highlight and hopefully demonstrate how risk matrices, due to their design characteristics, have an inherent flaw in them. Anthony Cox explains this in more detail, so I'm sort of paraphrasing what he says here, but hopefully it will make sense to you. Now, risk matrices are typically made up of probability down one axis and severity across the other, and they're normally chunked up into 5 blocks. Sometimes you'll see risk matrices with just 3 blocks. But they're chunked into those sort of sections: negligible, minor, major, etc., etc. In reality, of course, the severity and the probability are on a continuous scale. So in real life, things don't necessarily just fall into that block. There might be a difference within those regions. So for example, let's look at the major block in the middle there going across the top. If we considered that to be a continuous scale, then major, let's say it's a continuous scale from 0 to 1, and likewise for the probability. So in terms of probability, we'd have 0, that it's impossible that the thing could happen, going all the way up to 1, which is definitely going to happen. Normally in risk management and risk assessment, we can never be certain that something will definitely never happen, or certain that something definitely will happen. So usually we avoid using zeros and ones. But anyway, for this case, let's assume that we have this continuous scale, as we would, as things would be in real life, of these values going up from 0 to 1. Now, let's have a look. Let's say we have a hazard that we've assessed here as being, in terms of probability, we've assessed it as being 0.75 on our continuous scale here, and we are giving it a severity rating of 0.56. So that puts it there where that little blue dot is, and that comes out in the yellow region, which means that it is tolerable. If we multiply those two values together, we get an overall risk value of 0.42, and that comes out as tolerable in the yellow area. If we put this other risk, if we rate this one as, say, 0.62 in terms of severity and 0.62 in terms of probability, that gives us an overall score of 0.38, which is less than the previous one. However, this time, this is classed as red, that is intolerable. So what we have here is a risk that we've risk assessed using a risk matrix, where the actual overall risk for one of them is higher, but it's being classed as tolerable, whereas the lower risk is classed as intolerable. This is a very sort of condensed way of explaining some of Cox's argument, or his critique on risk matrices, because fundamentally there, the risk matrix isn't doing what we need it to do. It's not able to distinguish between tolerable and intolerable risk. And it's these kinds of fringe cases where risk matrices can become unstuck. You've probably all seen risk matrices like this, where we have not only the color-coded blocks of green, amber and red, but we also have the numerical values in there. So we have a frequent and major risk scores 15 there, so it becomes 3 times 15, and then we have catastrophic and frequent being 25, a score of 25. However, while we're using these what are seemingly quantitative values here, when we start to do things like think about, okay, well, is a hazardous and frequent compared to minor and frequent, does that actually represent twice the risk? 20 versus 10? Is it actually twice as bad? Why not 3 times, 4 times? It's just because the values we're using on the scales have given us this value that really doesn't have any meaning in reality. So we have to be cautious with this. So we're dealing with pseudo quantities. We're not dealing with real quantities here at all. What we have here is we have ordinal scales, and we're trying to multiply them together, and that doesn't make any kind of sense. What is occasional times negligible? What is the result of that? It doesn't make any sense at all. And it makes it difficult for us to go, okay, well, which of these is worse? Which of those two is worse? Which is the risk that I need to deal with first? Which is the one I need to throw resources at first? It doesn't help us in this case. In the ICAO guidance from the Safety Management Manual, 4th edition, they do provide some definitions of the likelihood. And as I said earlier on, the likelihood or the probability when it comes to risk assessment is usually harder to define and quantify than the severity. We'll mention that in a moment though. But ICAO has provided this guidance, so you can read those for yourself, but frequent, likely to occur many times, has occurred frequently. And that's a
value of 5. What that value represents in reality, it's not a physical quantity, so it's more of a label than a value. But what's missing here? Well, the thing that stands out to me is that let's look at this from the viewpoint of an airline like Ryanair, flying 400-500 aircraft or whatever it is, and building up a level of experience, historical data, huge number of flights going on every day. Now, compare that to someone who's flying a King Air or who's a fleet of 2 King Airs that does maybe a couple of flights a day. Do these definitions work for both organisations? I'd say not, because are we talking here about, when we say frequent, likely to occur many times, has occurred frequently, are we talking about in our own individual experience, our own organisation, or are we talking about across the industry in general? And this makes it difficult to actually use risk matrices properly. It could be that you need to decide, depending on the context that you're using, how you actually understand these definitions and meanings. So, but it's not particularly helpful there. In previous versions of ICAO's Safety Management Manual, they used to provide some further guidance on these definitions and actually state what frequent meant in terms of number of hours or number of cycles and that kind of thing, which was helpful. But I don't know why that was taken out, whether it was because it was maybe being too prescriptive, and maybe it led some people to become confused when it came to working out how to apply those kinds of definitions to their own context, to their own domain. In the 4th edition of the Safety Management Manual, ICAO have provided these definitions for severity and given a value. It's not really a value, it's more of a label again, but they are defined as being values for whatever reason. And as I said, these severity is easier to actually define when it comes to risk assessment, because we can usually look down that list and actually work out what is the most likely or the most credible outcome for whatever hazard it is that we're looking at. But we have that value there, which it still, when we're talking in terms of values, it does make us feel that we are dealing with something that's more quantifiable and perhaps more numerically based than what risk matrices actually are. But what this has led to is that the resulting risk matrix in the Safety Management Manual is no longer just multiplying out 5 times 5 equals 25 or 4 times 3 equals 12. It's actually now dropped those numerical values, and what we have instead is just labels really of, as you can see for yourself, 5Ds, 3Cs, etc. But the problem still remains is that when we look at that, due to the nature of risk matrices, how do we decide whether, say, a 4A is worse than a 5C, for example? Which one of these do we need to deal with first, the 4A or the 5C? We don't know, because we don't know, there is no, these are just labels, they're both red. We can't actually put a value on them and say, okay, this is the one I need to deal with first. So while risk matrices do have some value and they can be useful for a quick and ready risk assessment, if you're doing something that is properly safety critical, it really you really should be using a method that is more rigorous than just using a risk matrix. There have been some attempts to make the use of risk matrices more rigorous, and some of you might have come across the ARMS methodology. ARMS stands for airline risk management solutions, and it was designed by some airlines who were trying to put a more rigorous framework around the use of risk matrices. I think it's good in that it does provide that framework that makes practitioners think a bit more about the process that they're going through. And it has some interesting features where the risk assessor is asked to look at what the effectiveness of the remaining barriers. Think back to the bow tie that we looked at earlier on. It's asking the user to assess the effectiveness of the barriers that were left remaining. What was, how good were the barriers that remained? And it asks you to put a score using that matrix there to assess how effective the remaining barriers would be. So it's good that it does force the user to think a bit more about it and provide a bit more rigor. But again, it's still using values. We can see those values there, 502, 101. They give the impression that there is some kind of quantitative measure in place there, that the 502 is 5 times more than the 101. But these, again, are just labels. They're not talking about any kind of physical property at all. So again, they're not quantitative, even though they give the impression that it is a quantitative method by using these numbers here. And I think Cox would still claim that that has the same problems as risk matrices in general. I'm not going to go through the ARMS methodology in any detail here. You can read about it. There's lots of good resources available. There's a manual that is freely downloadable, and the link for that is on Canvas. And you can see a link on that slide there as well. So if it's something that interests you, I definitely encourage you to have a look at it. It is in use by airlines. It is more suitable for use in the sort of airline operational domain than it is in the sort of design or maintenance areas of aviation. And like I said, I think it's a good attempt to provide more rigor to risk matrices, but make no mistake, it is not a quantitative method, but it does have its use. That's a good opportunity for a break. So we'll pause there and come back in 15 minutes. I'll leave a countdown timer on the screen so you can get an idea of when we're going to restart. I'll see you in a bit.
As I briefly mentioned earlier on, regardless of what type of risk assessment we are carrying out, we often have to rely on subject matter expert knowledge. Subject matter expert knowledge is used to fill in the blanks where we don't have data, where we have to use people's previous experience, or in some cases where it's a completely new activity, we have to have experts' best guesses at what the probability, exposure or severity of a risk might be. The first question I want to ask you though is, what is an expert? When we think of experts, we often think of somebody who's maybe eminent in their field, who's a absolute world-renowned authority on a particular topic. When we're talking in terms of a risk assessment though, and when I'm talking about a subject matter expert here, what I'm actually talking about is somebody who is very familiar with the task or topic that we're talking about. So if you're conducting a risk assessment and you are talking about operating, again, I keep using this example, but operating into a new airport, and you want to look at the whole thing of operating there, from ground handling to flying into that particular airfield and so on and so on. When it comes to brainstorming the potential hazards, you need to get experts from all those areas. And say, for example, if we're looking at hazards on the ramp, the expert that you might use might be someone who does that job as part of their day-to-day activities. They are the expert. They don't need to have vast number of letters after their name or anything like that. It might be somebody who is doing that job. They've got first-hand experience of the activity that's being undertaken, that they can then contribute real-world experience to the brainstorming risk assessment session. So when we're talking about eliciting knowledge from subject matter experts, it covers a broad range of experiences, and it's better to include people who have first-hand knowledge wherever possible. As I just said, even with abundant data that we have in aviation, things like flight data monitoring, safety reports, and so on, there are often gaps in our risk models, particularly for probabilities, and that's where we need to get some help from people who are expert in that field. But it's hard. It really is. It can be very difficult. Fenton and Neal had an interesting book about risk assessment and focusing mostly on Bayesian networks, which we'll touch briefly on later on. But they say it's difficult but not impossible. It requires practice and is best tackled by trial and error. So the reason I'm covering this topic here today is just to give you some awareness that there needs to be some structure about how you go about eliciting this knowledge from the experts within your organisation. It'd be tempting just to put them all into a room and say, what do you think about this? There needs to be a bit more structure about it, and I'll give you some of the reasons for that in a moment. There are some protocols that exist and some documentation and some guidance that exist out there. One of them is the Stanford Elicitation Protocol, which gives you a sort of framework of how to go about undertaking this activity. And there are some other books. I'll give you a recommendation in a moment. One of the things we do have to be very careful though when we are getting knowledge from people or trying to extract knowledge from people is we have to be aware of the inherent biases that will be present. Like it or not, we all have biases. We all use bias in some ways just to help us get through life. And some of these you'll be familiar with. And a couple that I want to speak about, I'll give you some examples of, just coming up. This is a fairly well-known question that I've taken from Fenton and Neal's book that I just mentioned. It's a question that was asked of Harvard Medical School students, and not only students but some staff. So there's about 60 of them were asked this question.
And it was done a while ago now, back in the late 70s. But it's quite interesting. Just have a read through that and think about how would you answer that question. Usually when I ask this, I get a broad range of answers. And it's not just the medical world that has difficulty in answering questions like this, but similar questions have been put to people in the legal world as well, and various other domains. And we all have the tendency to get questions like this badly wrong. Let's just have a look at this. So if a randomly selected person tests positive, what is the probability the person actually has the disease? Well, the answers that the Harvard Medical School people gave, almost half gave the response 95%. I can understand why you'd give that response. The average answer, if you put all the answers together, the average answer was 56%. However, you might be surprised to know that the answer is just 2%. So if you get that positive test, the chances that you actually have the disease, in this case, based on the numbers there on the screen, the chances that you actually have the disease is just 1 in 50. And here's why. So here we have 1,000 people, okay? Now, 50 people get a false positive, and those people are shown in little grey things there. Out of those 50 people, only 1 actually has the disease. Remember that right at the start of that question, 1 in 1,000 people has a prevalence for a particular disease. Here is that 1 in 1,000 people. That person has correctly tested positive for the disease. These other people have incorrectly been tested positive for the disease. So if you've been tested positive, what's the chance that you've actually got the disease? Well, you're 1 out of these 50 grey ones. And that is something that is a common problem. It's called base rate neglect. We overlook this first sentence, really. It's that base rate that we forget. And this led to things like, in the legal world, this has led to wrong convictions, where the evidence or the interpretation of the evidence has failed to take into account the base rate of something occurring in society. Or, it might be us coming into contact with things as part of our day-to-day routine, as part of daily life. However, that then later being interpreted that we've come into contact with something that may be used evidentially against us, as was used in a terrorism case about explosives. I can't remember it off the top of my head now, but I'm sure some of you will remember that particular case. But this is something we need to be careful with when we're trying to elicit knowledge from subject matter experts, is that we often get this wrong. Another problem that us humans have when it comes to risk assessment and trying to estimate values and probabilities is that we are often overconfident. We have much more confidence in the answers we're giving than we should have. One of the things I do when I'm doing this live, and I'm sorry I can't be doing it with you today, is I give this little task to students, and what I ask them to do is say, I'm going to give them a number of questions, and it is on topics that they will be unlikely to have ever, it's unlikely that they'll get the answers absolutely 100% correct. I'll give you some examples in a moment. But what I'm asking them to do is say, give a lower range, a lower bound and an upper bound where you're 90% sure that the correct answer to the question lies within the lower bound and the upper bound.
Okay. And so, for example, here, what percentage of bronze is typically made of copper? And you might think, well, I think it's more than half. So I'm going to say between 60 and 80. So I asked them to write down those two values and for a series of questions. And then what we do, we go through the answers and find out how many people actually guessed or estimated that the value, estimated a value that was within that range. And then we have a look at the answers. Just to give you some examples, I'll just run through it quickly. But what I asked them to do is write down the lower and upper bound. And there's a whole series of questions like, how long is a Concorde aircraft? Now, you could have an estimate. It's unlikely that you'd probably know this off the top of your head. But, you might say it's between 30 and 40 meters or whatever. But what I'm asking them to be is 90% sure. Now, what we could say is it's between 0 and 500 meters. And you'd get the answer right there. Fine. But that's of no real use to us. So if we were thinking in terms of a risk assessment, being that broad isn't actually adding any real value to the process. So we're trying to be as accurate as possible, but also trying not to be overconfident at the same time. So these are the sorts of questions I ask. How long is ABBA's Dancing Queen? How heavy was the largest snail? And then I go through and give them the answers and we mark them. Now there were 20 questions when I do this. And given that we're asking to be 90% sure, then you'd expect in general people to get usually 18 out of the 20 right, 90% of them. Generally speaking, whenever I've done this, it's usually people get around about at most 4 or 5 correct. Some people just get 1 or 2 correct. So it's showing that we tend to be naturally overconfident in our ability to answer things that we aren't entirely sure of. So we're not properly recognizing our uncertainty when it comes to things like that. And you can see how that's problematic when it comes to risk assessment. So how do we deal with that? It's difficult, but there are ways of doing it. What you'll be glad to hear is that this can be better with practice and coaching. So I'll give you a recommendation for a book later on by a guy called Douglas Hubbard. And he provides a method of how we can actually coach our subject matter experts to get better at this. So if we were doing this as a brainstorming session and we had our subject matter experts in a room, what you can do is give them tasks like this to kind of warm them up. And so the more times you do this, the better you get at representing your uncertainty. And even giving them something where it's unrelated to the actual topic in hand, like this kind of dummy exercise here, people improve in the answers they give. The answers they give better reflect the uncertainty that they actually have. I wonder if any of you have come across the Dunning-Kruger effect. What I want to do now is show you a brief video that was taken from the BBC's Question Time programme some years ago at the time of COVID. And the format of the programme is where the audience that have been picked to represent a sort of cross-section of UK society, the audience can put questions to a panel, and the panel are normally politicians or experts. And in this case, we have somebody who's eminent in the field of vaccines. And it's quite an interesting exchange that happens here. Just have a look at this video.
Sorry, can I speak? Is that
Yes.
right? Cool.
Please.
No, I mean, I appreciate that, and I've looked at the data myself. I mean, the data I believe you're talking about is the yellow card reporting scheme, which are self-reported.
More than just the yellow card.
Fair enough. Okay.
Obviously,
but
looking at it on a global basis.
Well, okay, fine. But most of the data in the UK, for example, comes from the yellow card reporting scheme, which is a self-reporting scheme. There was a select committee in 1999 which estimated that there was an under-reporting factor. So roughly only about 10 to 15% of cases get referenced. And with the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's not simply, inflammation.
What's interesting here, listening to you, is you've got Robin here, who's a world-renowned expert,
Yes.
developing vaccines, researching vaccines for HIV and Ebola. He's given you information, he's given you... You're going through your notes, finding all sorts of other things. Is nothing he says credible to you?
Well,
given what an eminent scientist he is.
No, sure. No, of course it is. I studied philosophy at university, and I learned that an appeal to an authority is not an automatic win of an argument. And if we want to appeal to authority, for example, we could talk about someone, say, Dr. Robert Malone, who is the man who invented the vaccine, who suggests that young people, for example,
No,
don't take it.
I don't think he is the man who invented the vaccine.
He was critical in inventing
that.
mRNA
Hang on,
vaccines.
Let's let Robin answer that, and then I'll come to some other people in the audience.
It's nonsense. He didn't invent mRNA vaccine.
No, I think that's quite interesting because we have there the guy in the audience who knows a bit about the topic, but he is really very confident in that topic. He's confident enough in the topic to actually question the expert that's on the panel there. And I know he says that we should be able to question authority, absolutely. But also we shouldn't disregard expertise either. And I think it's interesting that he was confident enough in what he knew to actually go on live television and question the knowledge of this expert here. I think that's really interesting. And actually, this effect of knowing a little bit and being very confident in the little you know is well documented, and it's Dunning-Kruger documented this in a paper from 1999. I think it's really interesting, and it goes back to that old saying that some of you might have heard, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But what we have here is on the graph, we have our confidence. As we get to know a little bit about a topic, we are initially really confident about what we know. And then as we learn more, we start to realise what we don't know. And we get more experience or more knowledge, and it dips. And we're thinking, actually, the more I learn about this topic, the more I realise that I need to learn or that I don't know. And that's perfectly normal. It's not until we get over the other side that we start to get to be expert in our area. And we actually then, our confidence starts to rise up again. Interestingly, though, we might never get back to how confident we were when we knew just a little bit about it. But my point is that what we need to have, it's better to have people down here, preferably over here, of course, than it is to have people over here. So we have to be wary of people's overconfidence when they don't know that much about a topic. All of this is well documented. I mentioned that book by Douglas Hubbard, The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It. It's a really nice readable book that's really quite thought-provoking. But Hubbard does take you through how to try to extract better knowledge from subject matter experts, and gives you some practical ways of achieving that, trying to avoid that overconfidence. The reason why I've spoken about this is that we do need to rely on subject matter experts to get their knowledge, and it can be a really valuable process to go through, because subject matter experts are a valuable resource in any organisation, and actually asking them to document it and going through a process like this is a really good way of documenting or taking the knowledge that we have within an organisation at that point in time, because people move on, people change jobs, but if you can capture that knowledge as part of risk assessment, that can be a really useful thing to do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But what I wanted to, the point of this is that regardless of what kind of risk assessment process or risk assessment method we're using, we will have to rely at some point on getting knowledge from the people in our organisations and elsewhere. And there are ways that you can go about that
there are some pitfalls that you need to be aware of. Let's have a look at quantitative risk assessment. The methods that I'm going to give you a brief overview of now can be quite complex, and the idea here is not to give you chapter and verse and explain exactly how to use each of these methods, because we just don't have time. Each of these methods could well be a week or 2 weeks long course. So what I want to do is give you an overview of some of the methods that are available and how you could potentially use them. A method that you might have come across is fault tree analysis. Fault tree analysis lends itself well to processes and physical systems, and that's where it's really in use most. It tends not to be used so much in operational domains or where humans play a large role. So, for example, it's not used, I've never actually been aware of it being used in, say, the airline operations domain. But it's a really interesting and very well documented and tried and tested form of quantitative risk analysis. So what we have here is my sort of clunky diagram on the right hand side, very simplistic view of, say, toasting some bread in a toaster. And quite often, I don't know about you, but quite often I end up burning it for one reason or another. With a fault tree analysis, we take an undesired outcome, like in this example, burnt toast, and we use that as our top event, as our starting point, if you like. And then we work backwards from that undesirable outcome to identify failures which could lead to it. So in this example, the obvious one is that you set the setting too high. So you toast the bread for too long, it burns. Okay, straightforward. Something I tend to do quite regularly is I set it too low, and then I put the toast back down again. Then I get distracted by making a cup of coffee or something, and the toast, of course, does double the time, ends up burning, and the toast is burnt there. Now, how we would represent this on a fault tree analysis is we'd have our top event, the toast being burnt. We'd have our straightforward one, our setting being too high. But there's another way we can burn the toast. So we use this OR gate. So if either of these things occur, then that will lead to the toast being burnt. Over here, what we have is we have me making the setting too low initially, and then getting distracted, and the and is this AND gate here. And if both of those two things happen, then we can feed into this. Either of these can happen, and then we end up with the toast being burnt. Now, like I said, this is a really kind of clunky, simplistic example, but hopefully for those of you that have never come across fault tree analysis before, it'll give you an idea of how they work. And the powerful thing is that we can put on each of these nodes probabilities of how likely that is to happen. Now, we can either get that from data. So if I'd been making a note of how many times I set the toaster on too high, if I knew that that was, say, 20% of the time, I could put 0.2 in here. And that I could do so for this too. How many times did I set it in too low? Well, that's maybe 0.3, 30% of the time. Out of that time, maybe 15%, 0.15, I get distracted. So I can put those probabilities on these nodes, and then they flow through, and we can see, okay, how likely is the toast going to be burnt based on this chain of events, and how likely is it going to be based on that chain of events. Now imagine that being scaled up with lots and lots of different factors in there and different nodes. Then you can see how this can become a pretty powerful way of analysing and quantifying risk, because we can then look at what the most likely pathway to our undesirable outcome might be. And you can see from this, if you've got data relating to reliability or other data available to help you quantify these probabilities and put them into the fault tree analysis, then you can see how that would really lend itself to things like systems and processes, and indeed
that is the domain where fault tree analysis is most widely used. However, that doesn't mean to say it can't be used in other areas too. Event tree analysis is similar to fault tree analysis, but it's kind of looking at it from the other way around. So with event tree analysis, we have a top event, and then we work forward from that top event to see what the potential consequences might be. And we have a series of successes or failures that might lead to that potential consequence. So S here for success, F for failure. So say we had something like a fire in a control room or something as our top event. Then there would be some kind of smoke detection system, for example. I'm just thinking this off the top of my head. We'd have a smoke detection system that would hopefully raise the alarm. And we can say, well, 99% of the time that will successfully raise the alarm. Okay, so we would go 99% up to this success, and we'd go on to the next part. What needs to happen next? Well, there would need to be someone would hear that alarm and act on it. So we could put a probability in there, and then so on and so on. And so this sort of cascades towards different consequences. And likewise for failures, if the smoke alarm didn't work, then there would be some other system, or maybe somebody spotting that there was a fire or something like that. And we could look at the probabilities of those things occurring and put them into our event tree analysis here. And so what we end up with is, from the top event, we end up with this different pathways going towards different consequences. And the really powerful thing here is that if we can put those probabilities for successes and failures in here, then we can see, okay, if this top event is going to occur, what are the most likely consequences that would come from that? Okay, and we can see here by putting different layers of protection in how adequate they are and how effective they are, we can actually put probabilities against that. Now, ETA and FTA are both powerful methods, as I've said, and they are used across safety critical industries, particularly processes and systems, and used in safety critical domains like NASA, for example. They don't tend to be used so much in operational domains like airline operations, for example, or where there's a heavy human element to that. And they're not particularly good at dealing with uncertainty. So if we know the probabilities, if we know the failure rate of a component, that's really good. But if we don't know that, if we have uncertainty, like we know that a component might fail, or the chances of someone hearing an alarm are somewhere between 80 and 99%, how would we actually model that? And they're not particularly good at dealing with those things. Likewise, they're not so good at dealing with dependencies between events. So if you had, if you've read Charles Perrow's book, Normal Accidents, and he's talking about things being tightly coupled, in real life, it's quite normal for, if something goes wrong somewhere else, there could be an accompanying thing that's gone wrong somewhere else in the system that might not be directly linked, but actually they could have initiating events that are the same. So, for example, really bad weather or flooding or something like that could cause one part of a system to fail and then cause an entirely other different part of a system to fail, that the two aren't related, but actually, because the two things are failing at the same time, the consequences are different and the severity of it cascades. It's difficult for ETAs and FTAs to cope with that. And likewise, they're not that good at dealing with multi-state variable inputs. So they're good at sort of two inputs, as we saw in the little examples I gave a moment ago. But where things are more complex and there's much more variability in the system, then they tend not to be so good with that. And of course, when we're talking about things with a human input or a very complex system, then we do tend to have multi-state variable inputs. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And so in those cases, maybe ETA and FTA
aren't the best methods to use there. However, they are rigorous and they are used widely, as I've said, so definitely something to consider. Now, those of you that are familiar with bow ties already might be thinking, oh, that ETAs and FTAs ring a bell. And you're right. Basically, a bow tie is an event tree on the left-hand side, the threats leading to the top event, and then we have the fault tree over on the right-hand side with the top event leading to the consequences. And that's essentially how bow ties were born. It was that amalgamation of an event tree and a fault tree there. And we'll be talking more about bow ties later on in the course. Failure modes and effects analysis is another powerful tool, usually referred to as FMEA, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have used this in your day jobs. It's a tool that is used to analyse failures in hardware or processes, similarly to event tree and fault tree analysis as well. In this case though, and I'm really skipping over this because it's there are whole textbooks written on FMEA, so this is really just a very brief overview. But FMEA treats each component or process as having multiple failure modes, and each failure mode can have multiple effects, so it can have multiple outcomes, if you like. And these are risk assessed in terms of probability, severity, and opportunity for detection. So really powerful tool. And if we can put probabilities on those things, so what's the probability of this particular outcome? What's the probability of this this thing being detected in some way? We can see how that can build into quite a comprehensive analysis with that quantification, with those probabilities around each of the different opportunities for detection and each of the different effects and so on. And of course, it does lend itself to making use of data. So if there's failure data, component failure data, or data on how often processes work or fail, then that can all be included into the analysis. So for things like how often a human detects an alarm, or how often a human detects a change in system status, that can all be incorporated in the FMEA. I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, but this is from a paper from 2008 where the FMEA process is quite succinctly put down in 10 points, and you can read those yourself, but I would definitely recommend that you go and do a little bit more reading on FMEA, even if it's only the wiki page about it. But it's these parts that are potentially quantitative, that assigning a severity rating for each effect, assigning a probability rating for each failure mode, and assigning a detection rating for each failure mode and or effect. So that's where we can include data, and that's why this becomes a very powerful analysis. As I mentioned, FMEA, like ETA and FTA, are usually used for engineering type problems, but they have been used in other areas as well, and there's some research on that, so in medicine and project management, for example, and I'm sure you can think of other potential applications. Tend not to be used widely in operational risk assessment, so airline ops again, and it's most commonly associated with the design phase of an activity rather than the actual operational phase of it. Coming on to a method that does lend itself to the operational type environment, quite specifically this one is FORAS, Flight Operations Risk Assessment System. The idea of this is to provide flight crew with a risk assessment prior to flight, particularly what risk that particular flight represents on the day, and what those risks might be. And essentially what it does, it breaks down every part of the activity, so in terms of
it's specifically focused on a flight. And it breaks down that activity and splits each part of that activity into 3 areas. So for approach and landing risk, for example, here we have crew risk, those things relating to pilots and flight cabin crew, city pair risk, so those things relating to the physically flying between those 2 locations, so things like the air traffic control environment, the terrain, etc., and the aircraft risk. What are the risks associated with the particular aircraft we're flying, and that kind of thing. And it subsequently breaks these down into a further 3 different areas, and so on and so on and so on. And it's used, as you can see, it can get quite complicated. But what it can do, you can assign probabilities to these different nodes as they cascade down. And therefore, you can work out the probability of certain things happening, and you can use historical data that you have from safety reporting to feed into that. It is in use by some airlines. I think it's Eva Air are probably the biggest champion of it, and there is a video about this which is available on Canvas. I'm not going to go into it in any detail. It's worth having a look at that video if you're in the airline kind of domain. If you're not, then this is not the method for you, and that's why I'm not going to spend ages talking about it, because it may be irrelevant to some of you. A good thing about it is, like what we were saying earlier on about getting knowledge from subject matter experts, it does capture the knowledge available in the organisation from SMEs on safety risks, and it can allow that information to be reused through other risk assessments. And as I said, it gives a flight crew that pre-flight risk index, which is powerful when you think about it, because potentially, crew turn up for a briefing. It could be that normally the first officer would fly the first sector of the day for whatever reason, but actually it's been flagged up as being a high risk event, higher risk flight because of maybe weather for crosswinds, or maybe there's a technical issue with the aircraft like a thrust reverser lockdown or something. And the crew might decide, okay, for this particular sector, it'd be better if the more experienced pilot flew it. So it's like that, a kind of dynamic risk assessment there. And as I said, it can be combined with operational data, so historical operational data, although for some reason they recommend that it's not combined with flight data monitoring or FOQA data. I'm not sure why, it's probably documented somewhere, but to me, it would make sense for that historical data to be included there. But anyway, you can go and read more on FORUS if it's something of interest to you. Right, let's get on to something a little bit different. Now, I wonder if any of you have heard about Bayesian networks, or more specifically, Bayes' theorem. I should imagine some of you have. Bayes' theorem, please don't be put off by this. We're not going to go into a load of mathematical detail about the underpinnings of it. But Bayes' theorem, it's the guy on the left, that's a picture that is always used when we talk about Bayes' theorem. It's supposed to be of the Reverend Thomas Bayes, who came up with the theorem in the 17th century. No one's actually sure whether that picture is actually of the man himself, or whether it's just some other random person. But anyway, that's the picture you'll see if you Google Thomas Bayes or Bayes' theorem. Over on the right-hand side, we have quite a simple equation that is Bayes' theorem, and it's probabilities. So the H and the E stand for hypothesis and evidence. So this is basically saying probability of the hypothesis given the evidence is equal to that probability of the hypothesis times the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis, all divided by the probability of evidence. Now, it's quite a straightforward formula, but really what makes that intuitive is that it is how we essentially think and learn. Really what that is saying, although it doesn't look like it, is that as we are given more evidence on a particular thing, we update our previous beliefs.
So think of a baby starting out and learning about gravity, for example. Now, the baby may have no prior understanding or beliefs about how gravity works, maybe something instinctive. But gradually, the baby will get some understanding and realize that, oh, things, if they drop, they seem to go down. And then as more evidence is accumulated, the stronger that belief comes. If, say, for example, the baby dropped something and it went shooting up and hit the ceiling, then that belief that gravity makes things go down to the ground, that belief would become weaker. And so that's essentially what Bayes' theorem is doing. It's become popular more recently because underpinning some of this is some quite complex computational stuff that has to go on. And while the theory dates back from hundreds of years, it's only been in recent decades that we've had the computing power to actually make use of it to its fullest extent. And at the moment, I'm sure you'll be looking at it and going, well, what's this got to do with risk management? Well, Bayesian theory, or Bayes' theory, underpins Bayesian networks, and they are starting to be used more and more in risk assessment and risk analysis, and helping with decision making as well. And that's why I'm talking to you about it today and giving you a quick overview of why Bayesian networks can be very powerful in that field. Bayes' theorem, Bayes networks have been used widely and are used widely in other industries, drug trials, in financial risk. They underpin a lot of artificial intelligence today, environmental risk, and in the aviation domain, Bayes' theorem was used during the search for the Air France 447 that crashed in the Southern Atlantic. So let's look at an example of how Bayes' theorem and Bayesian networks might be used. Here we have that accident. It was Pegasus Airlines. It was in Trabzon. It was quite a few years ago now, but I'm sure some of you will remember the pictures of it. So if we were trying to look at the risk of a runway excursion, a runway veer-off event, which are fairly common. It's probably one of our most common types of accident that we have in aviation at the moment. Fortunately, usually they don't end up in mass fatalities, but of course they do have the potential to. All it takes is for an aircraft like that to end up in the sea, or for an aircraft to go off the side of the runway and collide with another aircraft that's taxiing, and those kinds of things. So the potential is there for it to be absolutely catastrophic. So it's important that we would carry out a risk assessment for something like that, particularly if we're going into an airport like this, where it's critical if you end up veering off the runway. So let's think of that in terms of Bayes' theorem, which we just saw, and put it into terms that might be a bit more friendly. What I've done here is just restated Bayes' theorem, but instead of hypothesis and evidence, I've put probability of the veer-off given causal factor. Now, because that's what we're interested in when we're looking at risk. We want to know, okay, how does the presence of a particular causal factor influence our probability of actually having a veer-off event? So, for example, if we wanted to say, okay, if we're flying into Trabzon, how different is our veer-off probability going to be if there is a gusting crosswind, for example? And that was something that when I was working in an airline, I was always frustrated that we had all this data available to us from flight data monitoring, from safety reporting and so on. And yet we didn't really make good use of that data to its fullest extent. Sure, we used it for regular safety reports and things like that, but we didn't actually or didn't have the knowledge or tools at our disposal to exploit that data to its fullest extent. And it always seemed to bother me that if I wanted to find out, okay, where are we most likely to have a runway veer off in the network of routes that we flew to, even though I had all this data, I'd be really hard pressed to actually come up with an answer to that question. So Bayesian networks have always really interested me. and they have the potential to exploit that data. But not only that, they have the potential to include not just quantitative data, but also qualitative data as well, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So coming back to this, so Bayes' theorem for a runway excursion would look like this. So we have that probability of veer-off given a causal factor is present is equal to, now that, remember, that's the bit on the left that we want to know about, but we need these things over on the right to be able to calculate that. So over on the right here, we have the probability of the causal factor given a runway veer-off. Well, that we can get from accident investigations. Accident investigation reports do that very well. They tell us, okay, there has been a veer-off event here. The causal factors that contributed to that event were icy runway, crosswind, unstable approach, and so on. So we know the probability of causal factors for runway veer-off events, just with a bit of basic digging. Probability of actually having a veer-off, well, that's easy too, because we can look at accident report statistics and say, okay, for the rate of runway veer-offs is X in Z number of flights or number of flight cycles, whatever measure you want to use. So we can get that from statistics that are published by the industry. And then the actual probability of the causal factor being present, well, we could get that from things like historical flight data, FDM, but we could also get that from things like METAR, the weather observations. So if we were saying, what's the likelihood of the causal factor of an unstable approach being present? Well, we could look at our historical FDM data results and say, okay, well, 1% of our approaches are unstable. Just plucking figures out of the air there. If we wanted to know how often is a runway at a particular airport contaminated, well, we can work that out from METAR observations and things. So we have that data too. So combine all those things together, we have all of this, which therefore means we can work out this side, which is what the safety manager, the risk assessor wants to know. What's our probability of having an event given a causal factor is present? I'm sure you can see how what a powerful tool that could be. Sure, it takes a bit of work. It's not as easy as just putting your finger in the air and going, oh, let's do a risk matrix and looking at the probability and severity and let's work it out from that. It's much more rigorous than that. And because it's more rigorous than that, of course, it requires more effort. So Bayes' theorem underpins Bayesian networks, as you might expect. And Bayesian networks are what's called directed acyclic graphs, which use probabilistic inference. That sounds a bit like gobbledygook to me, but what that's essentially saying, directed acyclic graphs means things can only happen in one direction. You can't get loops. So each node, each causal factor, if you like, leads to another node that then follows on to another node. You can't link back and get stuck in some kind of loop. So there's this kind of causal flow of how this all works. And what it is, each of these nodes gets updated. Once we have some data that we can add into a node, then that propagates through the rest of the network and updates the probabilities in the other nodes. And it does that through some pretty complex stuff that goes on in the background. As the user, though, you'll be glad to hear, there is software that does all this for us, and it does all that working out in the background, which is really helpful. Coming up with a structure for a Bayesian network can be relatively straightforward. This is an example from textbooks that you'll always find in Bayesian networks textbooks, where it's using a medical sort of causal diagram there. So it's saying that probability of being exposed to pollution, the probability of being a smoker, and then we have the patient having cancer. Then we have the probability of that being identified in an X-ray, the probability of the patient having shortness of breath, and so on. And so what the medic could do here, for example, is say, okay, well, we know that the X-ray was positive, and we know that the patient has shortness of breath. Therefore, what is the likelihood of them having cancer given that they were a smoker, for example? And so all that data can be added into the network, and it can provide some likelihoods that a particular condition is true. And like I said, there's software that will do this all for us. And quite often the actual structure of a Bayesian network is very straightforward. It's causal. You might have an intuitive understanding of how the different causal factors lead on to different outcomes and things. So can be quite straightforward, particularly in a team, to put the Bayesian network structure together. However, if you aren't sure of the causal links and you do have data available, then there is also the potential for the Bayesian network structure to be learnt from data, which is hugely powerful. But it's something that we're not going to go into in detail today. So Bayesian networks, these are called nodes. So where it's got smoker there, that's called a node. And these arrows are called arcs or edges. So they represent the dependencies between different nodes. And we could have multiple things going into each node. We could have multiple things going into smoker, for example, and so on and so on. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment.